Welcome, welcome. And before I make the bracha, let me say that I really appreciate, even if you're watching this as a recording, know that I appreciate your comments. I appreciate your likes, or if you dislike it, I guess I need to know that as well. Perhaps if you do dislike it, you should tell me why. And I realize that, of course, these recordings are low tech. I sometimes get phone calls or have to sneeze or something like that. So they're very raw recordings. I hope they're interesting enough, and I hope they're helpful to you. But please know I appreciate your written comments in the comment area, and I hope some of you will consider doing that if you watched, and especially, of course, if you felt it was worth commenting on, or if you have a question, etc. So thank you. And Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And here we go.
Amen.
Thank you. So Sundays, as you may know, we do Torah Temimah, and we're moving very slowly because there's a lot to be said. It's very in-depth, although I assure you that on a relative level, it's still scratching the surface of this material. And we're simply on chapter 1 of Genesis and on verse 11. That's where we are, even though we have many hours at this point here. So let's go to verse 11 as where we left off. So here we are. Vayomer Elohim, God said, Tadshe haaretz deshe, let the earth sprout forth with vegetation. Asev mazria zera, grass that is forming, that is seed bearing. Eitz pri ose pri lemino, and fruit trees that make fruit according to its species. Asher zar'o bo, in which its fruit is, al haaretz, over the earth. Vahichen, and so it was. So it was. So an underlying theme of that first chapter of Genesis is the ability to make distinctions. And if you think about it, one of the ways in which to understand knowledge is the ability to make distinctions. And if you think about it too, the more expert one is over a particular subject, the more one is able to see distinctions and differences. And for example, you think of a wine connoisseur who's able to make distinctions just by the taste that he or she feels on their tongue as to what kind of wine it is, what possibly even what year it was, quite possibly where it came from, all by the fact that they're so experienced and they know so much and they're capable of distinguishing one thing from another, one element from another. And so I think that's one of the reasons why this first chapter in Genesis has this underlying element of Vayavdil, right? That he made a distinction. And so we have the distinction of specific species. So I think there are two elements to that as well. One is the fact that we do have all this individualization, but the other aspect in having one divine source is the idea of all this coming together and living in peace and harmony, that there's harmony because there are different sounding notes and tones, and there's texture because musically speaking, there are different kinds of instruments, etc. And they're all necessary to give a deeper level of appreciation and expression, etc. And I think that's what we say when we say in the Kaddish, Ose Shalom Bimromav, who makes peace in those high places. Hu Yaseh Shalom Aleinu. May he bring peace to us as well. And the ability to disagree and yet be able to love one's interlocutor, I think is so important and so needed in this world, that it's not a question of one person being right and the other person being wrong, The issue is trying to gain an understanding, and that's not to say that there aren't times when a proof may be compelling, but there are also many kinds of statements and quote proofs that are not compelling but are strong and have merit to them. And so that's the thought about the fact that God asks this vegetation initially to be according to its kind. This is regarding the trees. You notice, and we're going to pick up on this at some point today. So here we are. Ose pri lamina, making fruit according to its species. Darash Rabbi Chanina bar Papa interpreted. B'sha'ah she'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu lemino ba'ilonot. Right? At the moment when the Holy One, blessed be He, said amongst the lemino, the word lemino, according to its species, regarding the trees, because we notice that in this verse, when it talks about making the grass, it doesn't say lemino, it doesn't say according to its species. It only says that regarding the fruit trees. And that's the point. This is the lemino that Rabbi Chanina bar Papa is referring to. So when God used this word, lemino, regarding the trees, nasu deshaim kal vachomer ba'atzman, the grasses drew an inference applying to themselves. So we're talking, a kal vachomer is an argument logically called an a fortiori. In other words, you're saying if it applies in case A, then there are reasons to say that it applies even more strongly in case B. I'll give you an example. So if something is forbidden on a festival, then for sure that is forbidden on the Shabbat, because we know that the laws of Shabbat are much stricter than the laws of festivals. So, for example, you're allowed to cook on a festival, you're not allowed to cook on Shabbat, and vice versa. If something's permitted on Shabbat, then for sure it would be permitted on a festival. And that kind of logical interpretation is applied to the Torah. And in this case, we're saying that the grasses apply this to themselves. Or this is the argument. Uma ilonot, and regarding trees, she'en darchan latzet be'irbuvia, whose habit is not, or whose practice is not, to come out in a mixture and in confusion. So when you think about trees, right, they come out as individual trees, whereas when you're looking at grasses, you're looking at a whole bunch of turf that are various different plants blended together. You really can't make distinctions. So, all right, so there we see it. And so they're saying that the trees are saying that, look, God, when it came to the trees, God wanted them to be according to their species. So here goes, Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu lemino, and when it came to trees, God said, according to its species, Anu alachat kama v'chama. How much the more so would it apply to us? In other words, again, just trying to clarify the argument. If God said, with regards to the trees, that under normal circumstances come out as individuals, and God nevertheless said to them that they need to distinguish themselves according to species, how much the more so would that apply to us? Because we're not individuated when we grow. When we grow in these clumps together and in turf, and you can't see one individual grass sprout or from another grass sprout. So if God wanted the trees to make sure that they were growing according to species, how much the more so does it apply to us? Miyad kol echad ve'echad, and immediately each and every grass plant, yatsa lemino, it emerged according to its specific species. And of course, we know there are many species of grass. Patach, and as a result, Patach Sar Haolam, the I would say the angel of the world. In other words, it's as if there's a grand angel that is in charge of the universe. Va'amar, and said, quoting Psalm 104, Yehi Kvod Hashem Le'olam, may the glory of God be forever. May God's glory be forever. Yismach Hashem b'masav. May the Lord rejoice in his creation, in his works. Harlan, did you have a question?
Yeah, you can't mix oranges and apples together. You can't mix the seeds together. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, the idea of grafting an orange tree to an apple tree is true. But here we're talking about simply the natural growth of these particular things,
Yeah,
right?
but each species is individual. You can't mix the seeds. They're individually, uh, God made them individual. A
Right,
fruit tree, an
right.
apple tree, a pear tree, but you can't mix the seeds.
When you say you can't mix the seed, what do you
Yeah.
mean by that? Do you mean you're not allowed to, or are you
Yeah,
talking about that you cannot?
yes.
You're not able to. Which of those, when you say you can't, what do you mean?
Well, if you plant one seed against another with another seed,
Mm-hmm.
what are you going to get? I mean, it doesn't make sense. You you should get your
Yeah.
uh, uh, individual fruit trees are they're individual. You shouldn't mix them.
Okay.
That's what I'm
I think perhaps you're referring to the law of Kilayim, where you're not
Yes,
allowed to mix grapes with other kinds of plants. That's
correct.
that's a law, and that is a law that's related to what we're talking about here, but that's not what we're talking about here.
Okay.
You're right that, yeah, when you're saying you're talking specifically more about grapes, and that's a law that's mentioned later on. And yes, this of course has to do with reinforcing the idea of keeping nature distinct. All right. So,
Mhm.
pollinating a grapevine with from an apple tree, I don't know that that would even produce anything. Okay. But here we're talking, I think, again about the beauty that there is beauty about distinction. The fact is that when it comes to our tastes, for example, even though there may be certain foods that can sustain us constantly, if you were to eat the same diet, exactly the same diet every single day, 24 every single day of the week, you just couldn't stand it. So I'm wondering if the very fact that there are so many different types of flavors and textures and fruit, that the diversity of the world is in fact a glorification of God. And that in a sense, that's what this is about. That
Mhm.
you think about all the various species. How many kinds of apple trees are there? How many kinds of wheat is there? And of course, when it comes to animals as well, all the distinct species are actually, as this applying this verse from Psalm 104 is in a way saying that this is kavod can also be understood as presence of God, referring to God's presence, and that the fact that this world is so diverse and has so many distinct types of things in this world amongst species themselves is part of God's glorification. That
Mhm.
that's something that is magnificent about divine creation. And of course, this particular midrash, as I believe Rabbi Epstein is going to say in his commentary, isn't to be taken literally. It's just a way of expressing metaphorically this element of divine grandeur and divine glory, because I don't think we always focus or recognize how magnificent creation is because of its diversity. And sadly, so often we see diversity as a reason for war and argumentation and hatred, etc. And in some ways, taking into account what we just read today, we realize what a devastating attitude that is. And I'm not saying that there aren't reasons, even within biblical literature, that could give rise to these attitudes. But I think that there are ways of dealing with those particular passages that suggest these things in a way that we can, first of all, we can apply those passages very often to elements within ourselves, and also recognize that the world in some ways is not the way it was. And that idolatry essentially, and there are statements like this that say that these days they were able to get rid of the Yetzer Hara of pure idolatry. And we have to be concerned about other kinds of things, but not necessarily react in a vicious kind of way. So it's not an easy question. It really isn't. But I think that this is such a beautiful passage that we just read, that it expresses in such a powerful way, in this metaphoric way, um, just this idea again of the beauty of creation in its distinctiveness, and also the glorification of God that goes along with it. So let me see if I can plow into the Baruch Halevi Epstein here. So he says, this is basically explaining the argument of the grasses. Shekulam nizdarzim umitamtsim, and the fact that it says immediately they realized this, they acted on it, okay? That to act in a way that they came forth, they sprouted forth as individual species. So mizdarzim, from the word zariz, they were very conscientious, umitansim, and they were insistent. They worked very hard, la'asot ritzon konam, to perform the will of their creator. Af shelo nitztavu, despite the fact that they hadn't been commanded to do this. We see that, of course, in the verse, that it's not, well, they weren't commanded to do it. But there's also another message here, is that just because it isn't explicitly stated in the Torah as a divine commandment, doesn't mean that we might not be commanded to do it by using logical application. And in fact, so much of the oral Torah is based precisely on this process, that there are various ways in which the Torah can be interpreted logically, using legal logic, which gives forth new laws and new mitzvot that are not explicitly mentioned, and saying that doing that is a really wonderful thing to act with which to act as a human being. Uchlal yaches kal vachomer, or yachas kal vachomer el deshaim, right? And the fact that he applies the kal vachomer, this a fortiori argument, to the grasses, katav maharsha. So the maharsha, and I made a note on the maharsha. His name was Shmuel Adels. This is when he lived, 1555 to 1634, was a renowned rabbi and Talmudist, famous for his commentary on the Talmud called Chidushei Halachot. This is found in every Vilna edition of the Talmud in the back. He's one of the backstreet boys, and a major commentary, and he has beautiful interpretations both of halachot, of laws, and also agadot. He also includes interpretations of Agadic material as well. Major player in Talmudic commentary. So he says, Dahu alpim masha katov. So the Maharsha wrote that this is based on what is written. Ein lecha kol esev. There's a statement elsewhere in the Talmud that you do not have any grass, shelo yeh lo malach milamala, that every blade of grass, right, has an angel above it, hamamuneh al gidulo, that is appointed regarding its growth. So there's this midrash that the Maharsha applies to what we just read. Okay, umityaches ze hamamar el hamalach, and he says that what we just said about the grasses doing this particular argument and applying something that was only applied to the trees and applying it to themselves, right? I think the point that he's making is that because they did this, they are granted this angel to help them sprout. Now, again, we are speaking very symbolically here in trying to express the relationship of God to the world and recognizing that growth itself, the ability of something to grow, is also can be understood as something divine, that God is the one behind the very fact that we're able to grow. And there must be an additional point, which at this point I'm not able to necessarily infer in saying that they have an angel. I mean, is it saying that grass tends to grow much more easily, that it's that if you've ever done any gardening, you know how easily grass seeds will spring up in places you don't want them to, partially so that this idea of having an angel has to do with its ability to propagate so much. So it's a thought. V'rak al pi shtachut halashon. Okay, now I have difficulty. I tried to find a translation, a good translation of this phrase, shtachut, or I think that's the way you'd pronounce it, halashon. And I think it's from a root of shetach. And shetach has to do with an area spreading out. And I think, and lashon would be language. And I think here, shtachut halashon, that this phrase means the fact that you can apply language in a very broad kind of way, right? Yachasu oto el hadeshaim atzman. And so again, the oto means it. Yachasu means they related it to the grasses themselves. So exactly, so is he saying here this idea of the angel being applied to each grass? Is he saying, and I'm because I myself am struggling to understand the point he's making here, is he saying that it has to do this whole piece that we just read, right? Cannot be taken literally, that it's something that is being expressed, that something's being expressed in a deeply metaphorical kind of way. And is that what he's saying here? That it's because language, we are able to express through language these kinds of things, that we apply it specifically to the grass, and not to say that it only applies to grass. But exactly what is meant here at this point, I am struggling with. The Iyen b'Tosafot, and he says, look up Tosafot, Chulin, in the tractate Chulin, page 7a, Divrei HaMatchil Amar, the beginning of their commentary there, which starts with the word Amar. Katfu Gamkin Karov Le'inyan Zeh. The Tosafot also wrote is in a similar fashion. I think, and again, not having checked this reference, and if I can, I will try and check the reference. He's saying that the Tosafot are saying something similar to what he's saying here. And exactly what that is, I'm not certain, whether or not they're saying that it's also a commentary on not to take this overly literally. And with that, we will stop. I'll stop the share and I'll stop the recording. I'm sorry. Thank you.